Hi everyone, so this video is on eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells were the first cells on Earth that had specialised internal compartments. So what we mean by that is those membrane-bound organelles, so things like the mitochondria and the nucleus. And they evolved almost 2.5 billion years ago now. Prokaryotic cells are a lot more primitive. So what we mean by that is that they're older and more basic. And they started to appear 3.5 billion years ago. So you can see that they're the oldest cells that we know of, really. And there's evidence that they may be even found on other planets, such as Mars. Okay, so let's have a little look. So why are we learning this? So in my other video, I talked about the fact that cells are fundamental building blocks of all living organisms, and that doesn't go away just because we're talking about sort of the classification of these cells. Prokaryotics are vital for all life on this planet. So an example of a prokaryotic cell is bacteria, and it's essential that we have that present in order to have our day-to-day functions, if you like. So bacteria plays a very big role in decay, for example. And understanding them helps us again to understand disease, because if I've just said that prokaryotic cell, an example of that is bacteria, then obviously having an understanding of that bacteria will then help us to understand how diseases are transmitted. Okay, so there's three things again today that we're going to look at. So to be able to describe the similarities and differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, to be able to describe how bacteria compares to plant and animal cells, which hopefully we're quite familiar with if you've watched the last video, and then to explain how prokaryotes are adapted to unicellular life. So if we break down that word unicellular, we can see uni, like a unicycle, means one, and cellular, so unicellular is one cell. Okay, so we're going to see how they're adapted to that. Okay, so first of all, I want us to do this quick recap activity. Now, it's exactly the same if you've watched the other video as what we did before, but I want to see if we can do it quicker and more accurately. So if you want to just pause the video here, the keywords are at the bottom for you to use. Okay, again, think about which organelles are only present in a plant cell. Think about the ones that are present in both. Okay, so we won't spend too much time going through this because I don't want this to be the focus, but obviously we've got the chloroplast, vacuole and cell wall that are only present in plant cells. Okay, and then we've got the cell membrane, the nucleus, the cytoplasm, mitochondria and ribosome. Okay, so moving on to eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. Okay, so eukaryotic cells here, examples of those are our plant cells, our animal cells, yeast, and also protists. Okay, so then we've got our prokaryotic cell here, which is what we've been talking about when we've talked about bacteria earlier on. Now, the size of these is very different. You'll notice that eukaryotic cells are significantly larger than prokaryotic cells. Now, 1 centimetre, if we remember from where we've done conversions in the past, is the equivalent of 10,000 micrometers. So if we have a little look here, we've got our unit, which is micrometers, and that's obviously really, really, really tiny. Now, we can see some eukaryotic cells, most eukaryotic cells, through a light microscope. However, prokaryotic cells, we can't because they're just far too small and a light microscope doesn't have the correct magnification. Okay, so if we think about the outer layers of those cells, eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane, which in plants and in fungi are surrounded by a cell wall, whereas when we're looking at prokaryotic cells, the cell membrane is surrounded by a cell wall. Now, there's a bit of a difference between the cell wall in a plant compared to a cell wall in a bacteria, which is what I mentioned before. So in a plant, the cell wall is made of cellulose, okay? Whereas in bacteria, although you don't need to know this, it's made of peptidoglycan, which is basically amino acids and sugars. So that for your exam is not relevant, but if you want to look in that in a bit more detail, then that's great. Okay, so then we'll have a look at the cell content. So we can see that there's, in eukaryotic cells, we've got the cytoplasm, the organelles, which are membrane bound. Okay, so things like the mitochondria and chloroplast. Okay, Now, prokaryotic cells have a cytoplasm, they have ribosomes because they still need to synthesize those proteins, but there's no mitochondria and there's no chloroplast present there. They're those membrane-bound organelles that we were talking about earlier. So the most probably noticeable and the most evident difference between the two is that a eukaryotic cell will have DNA stored in a nucleus. Okay, prokaryotic cells don't have a nucleus, so they have free DNA, if you like, which is in the cytoplasm. We've also got these rings of DNA, which I should come on to when we look at bacteria in some cases, which are called plasmids. And in bacteria, for example, that is where the genes for antibiotic resistance are. So it's really important that we have an understanding of those plasmids so we can develop antibiotics that are then able to come into contact with those sort of bacteria that have got those particular genes. Okay, and then when we look at cell division, now in a later video we'll talk about mitosis in a bit more detail, but eukaryotic cells, the type of cell division is mitosis, whereas prokaryotic cells, it's binary fission. Now, binary fission is asexual. Okay, so now on to bacteria then, and how this compares to plant and animal cells. Now I want you to just pause the video here and have a little look at that diagram, take it in and think about what structures, I should say, are present there that aren't necessarily present in a plant or animal cell, or which structures you can think of that are in a plant and animal cell that aren't necessarily present there. Okay, so you might have noticed there's quite a few different ones here. So if we look at, first of all, this is what I've talked about before, so the genetic material. So the genetic material we can see here is free. Okay, it's free in the cytoplasm, unlike in eukaryotic cells where the DNA is stored in the nucleus. Okay, we've got our cytoplasm, so that is in both plant and animal cells. We've got a cell membrane, so we know about that's where substances are exchanged, so substances can enter and leave the cell. Now, a slime capsule. So not all bacteria will have a slime capsule, but those that do, the reason why it's there is for protection. Okay, it's obviously a unicellular organism. That's what we talked about before. So it's one cell. So it needs to have this layer that offers a bit of protection for that cell. Okay, we've then got the cell wall, which so does a plant cell, but I've already spoke about the fact that the cell wall in a plant cell is made of cellulose, whereas in bacteria it's made of the peptidoglycan. Okay, so then we've got plasmids. So this is a structure that we've not come into contact with before, but you can see that they are here. Okay, and they're circular DNA. Okay, and that's where I was saying that the genes for antibiotic resistance are. Okay, and then we've got our flagella. So we might have come into contact, if you remember when you've learned about specialised cells and sperm cells, for example, have a flagella to help propel them. That's the case of some bacteria as well. Some bacteria also have that flagella to help propel them. Okay, so on to some questions now. So we've got 4 questions here. These are basic comprehension. It's just a matter of having that AO1 knowledge that I've talked about in the last video. So there's 4 questions that if you need to go back through the video, that's absolutely fine. So just take the time to pause it and then I'll go through the answers. Okay, so these are my answers that I came up with. So what is the difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells? So there's many differences between those two types of cell. Firstly, prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic. The genetic material in eukaryotic cell is stored in the nucleus. However, DNA in a single molecule is found free in the cytoplasm in prokaryotic, with additional DNA being stored as plasmids. Okay, so that's identified one of the main differences. So the main difference is how the DNA is stored, how genetic material is stored in the cell. Examples of eukaryotic cell, so plant, animal and fungi. You might have heard me say earlier yeast. Okay, now yeast falls into that category there, so fungi. Okay, an example of a prokaryotic cell, the most obvious one for us to talk about is bacteria, because we've gone through the structure, we're a bit more comfortable with that one, so we'll go for bacteria there. And why can't you see prokaryotic cells under a light microscope? Now, this is requiring us to have a bit of knowledge about a light microscope, which you might have to refer to another video to be able to recap that. But a light microscope has a relatively low magnification, okay? And prokaryotic cells are far too small to be seen through that microscope. You might be able to offer a better solution there and talk about the fact that you could use an electron microscope. However, that's enough detail for that sort of question. Okay, so again, there's 4 more questions here. So you might have to refer back in the video to look at the bacterial cell to compare the animal cell against it. But just pause the video now and then we'll go through them again. Okay, so list all the structures that can be found in a bacterial cell. So the structures that we should be thinking about are the cytoplasm, where the genetic material is found, the cell membrane, slime capsule, cell wall, plasmid, and flagella. That we said, flagella, slime capsule aren't always present, but we can make a note that they could be found there. Okay, the question's asking what could be found. So what is a plasmid? Plasmids are circular DNA molecules which are present in bacteria. And if you've gone into the detail of saying that the genes for antibiotic resistance are often found there, then that's great. What are the 2 differences between animal cells on the right here and bacterial cells? So if I go back, okay, so we've got a bacteria here. So looking at this, we can see, can't we, that there's the slime capsule, there's the plasmid, there's the flagella that we might want to talk about, although not necessarily the flagella, because the sperm cell is an animal cell that has a flagella, which we'll come on to when we're looking at these. Okay, so the animal cell has a mitochondria and a nucleus, whereas bacterial cells doesn't. The bacterial cell has plasmids and a slime capsule. Okay, so that's given some of those differences. So where is the DNA found in a bacterial cell? So the DNA is free and loose in the cytoplasm, it's not housed, but there's also the circular loops. Now you'll notice that there's a common theme between all these questions, and a lot of them are referring to the fact that eukaryotic cells has a nucleus and a prokaryotic cell doesn't. Okay, that's the main distinguishing feature. Okay, now this time we've got some exam questions. So we've got the first one, which is asking us to contrast plant and bacterial cells, and the second one, which is asking to compare animal cells and bacterial cells. Both are worth 5 marks. So if you pause the video, give yourself about 10 minutes to write a clear, concise answer for both of those questions. Okay, so let's have a look at what the mark scheme's saying. So you'll notice that the start of both of these are very similar. So there are many differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. Firstly, prokaryotic cells are smaller than eukaryotic. Genetic material in a eukaryotic cell is stored in a nucleus. However, DNA is a single molecule found free in the cytoplasm in prokaryotic cells, with additional DNA being stored as plasmids. Now, it's asking me to contrast. So that's saying, tell you the differences. Okay. So I've said both bacterial cells and plant cells have a cell wall. Okay. But it's really clear that that's not made from the same material. So that's my contrast there. I'm saying that, yeah, they have a cell wall, but I've contrasted that. Okay, so looking at animal cells and bacterial cells, again, I've used the first part is relevant to both because we're talking about eukaryotic cells. Okay, and then we've said at the end that one of the similarities may be that specialised cells, such as sperm cells, have a flagellum, which is also the case in some bacterial cells. Okay, so we've got to be really clear when we're looking at command words. So contrast, if it's just contrast, that's the differences. So if we're contrasting likes of different people, we're going to look at the things that are different. Okay, if we're comparing, we're saying, well, what's the similarities and what are the differences? Okay, so the next set of questions here are referring to mainly this diagram. Okay, so take the time to look at this diagram clearly and carefully. There might be some annotations that you might want to make on your bits of paper. Okay, it might be worth just having a little look and a think about what you can already spot that's different, okay, because it's asking about a yeast cell. Now, if you weren't sure what a yeast cell was, okay, you can use the diagrams here to guide you. Okay, there's some very clear points that can be made from looking at the structure of those diagrams. Okay, so if you pause the video. Okay, right, so I've kind of zoomed in a little bit on this question. Now, if you weren't sure about what a yeast cell was, obviously earlier on I've said that it's a fungi, but if you didn't know that, what you could do is look at this diagram. Now, the one thing that makes it clear that the yeast cell must be eukaryotic is the fact that there's a nucleus. Okay, and then we've got our bacterial cell, which doesn't have a nucleus. So both the yeast cell and bacterial cells have structures A and B. So this is the things they have in common. Name structures A and B. So if we look at A and A here, so we can see that that is the line on the outside, so therefore it must be the cell wall. Okay, and then it asks what structure B is, which is here and here. And we can, if we're a little bit unsure, we can see that the DNA is floating, if you like, or it's freely moving within this structure, so therefore it must be the cytoplasm. Okay, so the yeast cell and the bacterial cells have different shapes and sizes. Give one other way in which the structure of bacterial cell is different from the structure of a yeast cell. If we go back, even if you don't remember, you don't have the knowledge here, use those diagrams. The diagrams are always there for a reason. So you can see clearly that the yeast cell has a nucleus, the bacterial cell doesn't. Okay, so suggest whether a yeast cell is a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell and why. Okay, so again, look at the diagram, we can see it's got a nucleus, so therefore it must be eukaryotic, okay, it's not prokaryotic. Okay, so the three learning outcomes which we were going to look at today was to be able to describe the similarities and differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. Okay, we were going to be able to describe how bacteria compares to plant and animal, and then we were going to explain how prokaryotes are adapted to unicellular life. Now, if there's one of those that you're not quite sure of or you're not quite clear of, just flick back through the video and revisit it. It might be that this second point about the bacteria is maybe a bit confusing for you, and remembering the structure. Go back and test yourself on it. See if you can annotate that structure. Okay, draw the diagram, see if you can annotate it. It might be that you're thinking about, well, how are prokaryotes adapted for unicellular life? Now, if you have a flick back through, you'll hear me talk about that in a bit more detail. So just, if there's a part that you're not quite clear of, just take the time now to go back through, maybe have another revisit of those exam questions. But hopefully what we've done today has helped